Hey guys, this is my veining tutorial. I'm going to show you how I create veins at the moment using an airbrush and also a tiny little fine liner brush. So this is going to be for quite obvious veins, like something like an infected thing or a zombie bite or some kind of virus, but you can definitely make them more subtle to make them more realistic as well. So first of all, I'm going to get out my airbrush and my compressor. I'm using the Apache H airbrush set, which is pretty cheap and pretty decent. I'm going to get my hose, I'm going to get out the gun, whatever it's called. I'm going to attach it to my compressor and get it all set up. So I'm going to use the number 3 needle, and what you want to do is you want to wind it so that the needle pokes through as far as possible before it stops and won't let you twist it anymore, which will let no pigment through, and then you twist it back in the opposite direction a tiny bit so you allow just a small amount of pigment through, which will give you the really fine lines. Since I don't yet own any airbrush inks, I'm going to do a method which my friend Kate taught me, which is basically I'm going to put a little bit of alcohol into the cup of my airbrush, and then I'm going to put some alcohol into my Skin Illustrator palettes, and I'm going to mop up those pigments and put the pigments into the alcohol in my airbrush. But obviously if you have the actual airbrush inks, it's way easier to use the liquids. So first of all, I like to just get the nozzle nice and wide and just kind of spray some of those pigments through to get it flowing, and then you can kind of tighten it and just play around and see like how much pigment comes through and work out what you like. To get a more diffused and under the skin look, if you hold the airbrush further away from the skin or the paper, it's going to have a more diffused and less intense look, and the closer you go, the sharper and darker the line's going to be. I'm going to start doing the main lines with my airbrush, and I'm using the vein tone from the Skin Illustrator Fleshtones palette. And so to help with the pattern, I've heard to imagine it as like a river or imagine it as lightning bolts. And basically you don't want it to look too uniform, you don't want to do the same kind of patterning. You want it to be kind of a bit more random, a little bit curvy. So I just play and I see what looks right, and if it starts going in a bad direction or I don't like it, I'll just simply start again. I'm going to use this little tiny fine liner brush by Bdellium tools. I'm going to go in and do a little bit of hand work as well. The trouble with hand painting is you don't have a consistent amount of pigment and alcohol in your brush because the alcohol evaporates, so you're constantly putting more alcohol in. So what I find is helpful is first of all you can test the brush on your skin before putting it onto the skin that you're working on to see how much pigment and alcohol comes out. And if you are finding there's too much alcohol, you can simply swipe the brush along the edge of the Skin Illustrator palette just to get out any excess alcohol from it before you put it onto the skin, because excess alcohol is what will cause it to bleed and not have a neat tight line. And then I'll use this to do the finer capillaries on the skin. So I find that because the airbrush is it's got air in it, it looks like it's more underneath the surface because it's a more diffused colour. Whereas because the brush is a more concentrated colour, it will look like the capillaries are closer to the surface of the skin and have a bit of a sharper line. I find one of the benefits of using the brush is that I can get finer lines than I could get with an airbrush, and it also creates some variation in the way the lines look. So you've got the airbrush veins which look more underneath the skin, and you have these capillaries which are smaller and tighter and sharper lines which make them look like they're closer to the surface of the skin. And I find just that variation in the way that it looks, instead of it all being uniform, it makes it look a bit more realistic. So for the last one I only used the vein tone. Now I'm going to experiment with a more purpley capillary tone. There is a capillary tone that Skin Illustrator makes. It's in their complexion palette, but I don't own that. So to make something that's kind of purpley and more a capillary colour, I'm going to mix the bruise tone with a little bit of the ultra blue from the Special Effects Skin Illustrator palette. And I do find that these two mixed together don't come out of the airbrush as smoothly as the vein tone does. I'm not quite sure why. So for this I feel like I have to open the nozzle a tiny bit more so it flows better. If the airbrush feels particularly blocked, I'll just open up the nozzle all the way and just shoot a big blast of the ink through onto a piece of paper or my arm or somewhere that I'm not, doing the detail work. And then tighten it back up again, and that seems to get it flowing a bit better. As you can see, there's a couple of spots where I'm starting at the airbrush, and as you get more control of the airbrush, you can learn how to press down on the nozzle in a way that doesn't have that big burst of colour happen when you start to paint. But I'm not super experienced with the airbrush, so it still kind of happens for me. So I usually warm up a little bit before doing the final look. And again, I'll go in with my brush and do the little tiny detailing of the capillaries of this. I guess the purple gives it more of kind of like an infected look. And another thing that helps with the brush is if you keep your brush, which is something I don't do all the time because I forget, but if you keep your brush straight up and down using just the point, you'll get a more even line, whereas if you kind of bend the brush to the side, that's when the line will not be as even. And so if it goes from like thick to thin and then thick again, like you'll find that the veins and capillaries don't tend to go from thin to thicker, they only tend to go from thicker to thinner, and so that will help you with your realism if they don't kind of have this inconsistency of going thick, thin, thick, thin. I will also vary the way the lines go, so sometimes they'll curve to the left or the right, or they'll go straight, but usually I won't go a full 180 back up because the veins that I've seen at least usually don't go back in the other direction all the way. Now I'll show you an example where I'm going to start off using the vein tone, and then I'll come in and also use the capillary tone on top of it. So I'm going to start off doing a little bit of the thicker blue vein toned veins. The colour is slightly different from before because I still had a little bit of the bruise tone and the ultra blue inside the cup when I put the vein tone in. So I'm going to go in with the capillary tone now. I'm going to start from one of the branches of the vein tone and then bring the capillary tone out from there. I'm going to have it start connecting back up with itself or back up with the vein tone veins as it is a network. So this is just the way that I'm doing it right now. It's one style. There's obviously a lot of different variation in the way that veins and capillaries look, but hopefully watching this will help you. So we go back in with the brush and do a little bit of the brush detail to get the ones that look more on the surface, little tiny capillaries. So if you make a mistake, or if the colour comes out too pigmented or too much alcohol and it bleeds, you can easily fix it just getting a cotton tip and dampening the cotton tip with your isopropyl alcohol and then using this to remove the colour on the skin. So that one came out a little bit too dark, so I'm going to use a cotton tip to remove the colour and just do it again. So now I feel like I've done a bit too much and I want to soften some of the lines and erase some of the lines with a cotton tip. So I'm just going to go over it all with that now. And another tip for removing pigments, which is something that my friend Kate learnt from a YouTube video with Neil on the PPI Premier Products YouTube channel, is you can place a tissue down over the arm and you wet the tissue with isopropyl alcohol, and then the tissue and the alcohol will absorb back some of the pigments without ruining the detail that you've put down. And it's just a way to soften and retake up some of that colour. So along with using the veins to create some kind of virus or infected look, you can also use it for things like zombie bites or little infected wounds like this one that I made with maggots coming out of it. So if you wanted to make your veins a bit more natural, or if you go overboard, you can always start removing the colour and seeing what gets left behind, as well as just using more diluted colours and going a lot softer on the lines when you're creating it if you want to look more natural underneath the skin. Another option is once you finish painting on the veins, you can go over it with a flesh coloured foundation or cream, or even flesh coloured alcohol pigments. And yeah, so I don't know, hopefully this helped and you enjoyed it. And if you are not already following me, these are my social media pages. I'll put all the links in my description box. And yeah, thanks for watching. Alright, bye.